After Claire inherits her grandfather Edward's $2.4 million estate, her husband Colin quickly reveals predatory intentions. He brings estate lawyers to pressure her into transferring control. A staged family meeting becomes an ambush. Claire, warned in her grandfather's letter about Colin's eyes for money, quietly gathers evidence of his financial manipulation. She calls in her own formidable attorney, exposes voice memos and bank records proving Colin's scheme, and refuses to sign. She moves out, protects the inheritance via an irrevocable trust, and uses part of the money to found vocational centers and a home improvement grant for women escaping abusive or controlling relationships, turning betrayal into community empowerment. The phone sliced through the thin blue hour before dawn, a single, insistent ring that pulled Claire from a grapevine sleep. For a moment the house felt like a borrowed thing, porcelain cups on the counter, photograph frames angled just so, until Mr. Harrison's voice filled the room, grave and too steady. "Mrs. Whitmore," the will reading. 10 o'clock. The syllables landed like a stone dropped into placid water. Everything rippled. She dressed in the cardigan her grandfather liked, the one that smelled faintly of cedar and motor oil. In the kitchen, she paused over his old enamel mug, its rim nicked from 100 stubborn afternoons, and remembered how he'd taught her the difference between a Phillips and a flathead by the light of a single bulb in the hardware store's back room. Those memories wrapped around her like a rope, warm, comforting, and finally restraining. In the mahogany office, the will had the gravity of ritual. Mr. Harrison read with a kind of reverent steadiness, "To my granddaughter, Claire Whitmore." Her name arrived and held the air hostage. The letter was folded in a way only her grandfather had folded things, careful, as if to tuck words inside the seams of fabric. He had left her everything: the Victorian house, the hardware store, the small portfolio he guarded like a secret. Claire listened and felt the room tilt. Later, in the car with the envelope on the passenger seat, she slid her thumb along the postmark of his handwriting until she found the hesitation in his script, the looping "Why ask you?" as if he'd looked over his shoulder while writing. She read the letter on the highway, the sun painting the dashboard gold. "You're the one who asked to fix the Ford," he'd written, because the car had a story. "I leave this to you because you listened, not because you counted." He'd signed it Edward Whitmore, and beneath that, a careful, small line: "Be careful who you love, Claire." That line hooked something sharp in her chest. She thought of Colin's easy laugh and the way he had learned to make decisions for two, sliding into the role of provider like a well-fitting jacket. She thought of nights when he reached for her fingers and counted their obligations aloud as if they were an inventory. The doubts were small at first, like hairline cracks in glass. She smoothed them with distraction, meal plans, mortgage rates, the tiny rituals of married life. Driving home felt like arriving at a stage set: familiar furniture, ordinary light, and her husband sitting at the granite counter with a mug balanced in his hand. "So," he asked, a question that doubled as calculation. His smile held an edge she hadn't seen before, a brightness that was a mirror reflecting numbers. The mug slipped and shattered as she said, "Everything." The sound of ceramic cracking pulled the air out of the room. Her grandfather's letter warmed her palm where it sat folded in her purse. She felt gratitude, and with it, an unwanted alertness. The gift felt sacred and fragile, like the Ford in the garage that needed patient hands more than new chrome. Somewhere in the small, surprising silence between them, a choice had been planted. She could believe the benefit of doubt continued to be generous, or she could listen to the small inner voice that had been attentive enough to learn hand tools and histories. Claire stood in the kitchen then, sunlight catching the dust motes, considering the weight of a promise and of a warning. It was a quiet morning, but the arc of everything ahead was already beginning to bend. She folded the letter, thumbed the worn edges, and said aloud to herself, less a vow than a measuring of options, "I won't rush this." The words were simple. Their consequence would be anything but. In the week that followed, Claire felt as if she was learning to listen to the house. The grandfather clock in the foyer ticked with a new patience. She spent mornings in the hardware store's dust, barefoot on scuffed linoleum, running her fingers along old counters and cataloging inventory as if she were cataloging permission slips of a life. The store's smell, sawdust, oil, metal, was a bomb. But outside those walls, the edges of her marriage began to show. Colin moved through the days with a buoyant efficiency that now carried a different undertone. He balanced spreadsheets the way other people balance bills. His voice when he spoke of investments had the lilt of someone who'd found a comfortable rhythm with money. There were little things that lodged themselves like splinters. A credit card receipt tucked into a jacket, a vacation booked in a name she barely recognized, offhand mentions of liquidating some assets, as if the word assets were a weather report. She started keeping small notes, dates, amounts, a terse record of strange conversations. It wasn't paranoia, it was an archival habit she'd cultivated at work, the same meticulousness that turned scattered notes into a narrative. When she found the envelope with his name on it, a memo about an opportunity that mentioned flipping property, she felt a tightening in her chest. He smiled when she asked, deflecting with charm, just thinking about possibilities, love. Possibility, she learned, was often the velvet glove around an iron plan. At night, she found herself listening to Colin's sleep talk, not out of spite, but from a new professional curiosity, how his mind spoke in the quieter hours when facade thinned. Once she heard a muttered phrase she couldn't dismiss, flip it before she gets attached. It was a line that did not belong to the man who told stories about fixing carburetors with Grandpa. She tucked that whisper into her notes and let it ferment into suspicion. The invitation to Sandra's Sunday dinner arrived innocuous, a 3-line text, polite and clipped. Claire felt an instinct tighten, small alarms going off in a control room she'd just realized she ran. She called Deborah Lane, who'd once argued a case for a colleague and left an impression the way thunderstorms leave a scent, sudden, electric, unmistakable. Deborah agreed to stop by that afternoon, deliberately casual, the kind of presence that might be dismissed as coincidence. Sunday's sky was a bruised, unreadable gray as Claire pulled into Sandra's drive. The porch lights made the front steps look colder than they had any right to be. Inside, the living room had been rearranged into a semicircle of chairs, a speaking circle or a courtroom. She couldn't yet tell. Colin's smile at the door was practiced, too bright. 2 men in tailored suits sat like crows on the couch, their briefcases neat geometric shapes. Evan hovered near the window, a name she trusted but now felt a little distant. The first minutes were casual. Sandra moved like a woman trying to keep warmth on the edge of danger. Then the legalese landed, an offer of help. A joint trust floated like a bridge to the future. The phrasing was kind, professional, full of tax-advantage euphemisms. Claire felt the room closing in. The chair circle became a ring of fishhooks. But she steadied herself. She'd been preparing, not out of anticipation of this, but by habit, paying attention, saving receipts, keeping voice memos. Preparation, she'd learned, was a form of patience. When Colin's tone shifted from coy to insistent, the pivot felt rehearsed. Claire's reply was measured. I need time. It was a small stone cast into a growing pool, but it rippled. The men exchanged a look that tasted like contempt. Colin's joy tightened. His eagerness exposed him. Claire tucked her hands into the fabric of her coat and watched their faces. Practiced lawyer faces, practiced manipulator faces, the faces of people who assumed consent could be manufactured. She left with an ally and Deborah on the horizon and a kernel of righteous clarity forming. It wasn't yet victory. It was the architecture of one. She would not be rushed, not by smiles nor by legalese. She'd been given a gift and a warning. She would steward both. The decision was moving from something she felt to something she would prove, quietly, legally, with the same careful hands she used to mend a stubborn old Ford. The days ahead would require construction, not sentiment. The twist did not arrive like thunder. It arrived like a slow leak, one that, once found, explained every damp spot and warped board. Claire had begun combing for evidence with the calm precision of someone cataloging an antique, bank statements lined up like specimens, text logs, and the small brittle things that betray intent. It was in a routine search for a dinner reservation that she opened Colin's phone and found the voice memos, dozens of small audio files filed like receipts. Most were mundane, but one file made the granular air around her vibrate. He'd recorded a conversation with Jake that read like a blueprint for predation. Once she signs, we'll flip it, sell the house, liquidate the antiques. By the time she's sentimental, we'll be gone with profit. The voice on the memo was light, conspiratorial, the sort of casual cruelty that happens when someone imagines you as a resource and not a person. Claire listened twice, 3 times, until the words were iron-rimmed and undeniable. This discovery shifted the scene in her head. It reframed past grievances, the roof check that never happened, the mysterious $4,000 charge, the surprise BMW in the driveway, into a pattern. Betrayal is a cartography of small acts. She began to map them. The memory of Grandpa looking up at a leaking ceiling after a storm no longer felt like a private sorrow. It was a warning flashbulb she had ignored. Armed with the memo, Claire threaded together bank statements that showed withdrawals made in the name of opportunity and payments to names she didn't recognize. She'd always been the one to call contractors, to ask for itemized invoices. Now she found invoices that didn't match the work they claimed. The roof, meant to be fixed with Grandpa's gift, had been used as seed money for a volatile online scheme that crashed and took half of the funds. Every small excuse Colin had offered now stacked into a legal narrative. She invited Deborah for coffee and unfolded the dossier statements, receipts, voice memos, and a chronology Claire had arranged with the meticulous care of an archivist. Deborah's eyes skimmed, narrowed, then softened around the edges in a way Claire read as calculation. "You didn't stumble into this," she said. "You worked for it. Good. Evidence is a sword when wielded with patience." The lawyer's tone was clinical, grateful. It made Claire feel less like someone who had been ambushed and more like someone who had learned to fight. That afternoon, Deborah agreed to attend Sunday's meeting. Claire texted Colin, softening her message into a casualness designed to disarm, no accusation, no alarm. "Mom's making dinner. Come early to help." If Colin read it as normal, that was his miscalculation. Claire had planted a different arrangement, her attorney in the wings, the dossier on the quiet, and the voice memo loaded into her pocket as a last, decisive card. When she walked into Sandra's living room, the air smelled like a place where things were about to be decided. Chairs circled like an old tribunal. Colin's face was the same that made her marry him, familiar, practiced, but now it had a pale sheen. The 2 men in suits, Hendricks and Morrison, presented documents with breezy confidence. Their terms were altruistic sounding, financially sound, and, when you stripped the language, coercive. Joint trust and immediate liquidity were euphemisms that hid transfer of control. Claire felt the pivot as Deborah arrived, silver hair, calm step, the smell of lavender and surgical confidence. The room's temperature changed. Deborah's breezy comment, "Good afternoon, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important," landed like sunlight cutting through fog. The men's poise wavered. Colin's smile began to crack. Claire laid out the memo. She pressed play. The recorded words, delivered into that ring of chairs, did more than accuse. They narrated intention. The room rearranged itself around that audio. Evan's eyes dropped. Sandra left the kitchen to avoid a line of sight that would implicate her, and the suited men started to fold their documents like deck chairs in retreat. Colin's face cycled through rage, denial, panic. He attempted to explain, to call it hypothetical, to twist it into a harmless conversation about options. But the audio resisted reinterpretation. The midpoint twist was not simply discovery, it was inversion. Power had been assumed by certain people because of custom and closeness. With proof, the assumed owner became the accused. Claire's discovery had turned an intimate betrayal into an evidentiary truth, and the truth has a way of reorganizing loyalties. The men who'd come to steer assets out of her hands now suddenly had reasons to close briefcases and leave. Claire felt a small, cold thrill. The evidence was no elegant deus ex machina, it was the product of slow, patient work. The realization settled over her like a blueprint unfolding. This would require more than moral outrage. It would require legal armor. But for the first time since the will reading, anything like hope felt practical instead of naive. After the voice memo played and the suits retreated, the scene did not evaporate into immediate triumph. There was paperwork to be parsed, emotions to be managed, and a moral geometry that would demand time. Claire and Deborah sat at the kitchen table, the dossier spread between them like a map. Colin hovered nearby, alternately pleading and strategizing. His face had the gray-pale look of a man realizing his plan had been outmaneuvered. Deborah's questions were precise: dates, account numbers, exact phrasing. For each query, Claire offered evidence. The lawyer's pen moved in small, decisive ticks. "We'll file for a temporary injunction if they try to move assets," Deborah said matter-of-factly. The legal rhythm, the clean, confident cadence of procedure, felt like armor. There were filings to prepare, notices to send, and, crucially, a need to secure the inheritance from both immediate coercion and subtle siphoning. Colin's defenses shifted through recognizable phases: minimize, charm, threaten, cajole. He reminded her of their shared life, mortgage, mutual acquaintances, Sunday rituals. He suggested counseling, shared goals, and repair, as if those words alone could patch the seam he'd been slicing with years of small manipulations. Claire listened with a new interior coolness. She catalogued his pleas like exhibits. They no longer persuaded. A domestic fallout is less cinematic than lawyer speeches. It is procedural and granular: phone calls that go unanswered, messages that turn from plaintive to menacing, financial instructions that must be unwound. Deborah guided Claire through the practicalities: immediate separation of certain accounts, freeze against transfers, formal documentation of unauthorized withdrawals for potential criminal referral. Each step felt like removing nails from a coffin the way one removes small, persistent nails, careful, necessary, and inevitably revealing. In the background, Claire began transforming grief into design. She drafted a plan for a half-dozen initiatives she wanted to seed with her grandfather's money. It wasn't merely charity, it was targeted restitution, a home safety grant for women, vocational courses at the old hardware store, an emergency fund for repairs. Putting pen to paper, naming the grant the Edward Whitmore Home Improvement Fund, she felt the inheritance shift from abstract weight into tools: concrete, measured, actionable. Family members reacted in their own rhythms. Evan called her later that week, a quiet voice, an apology too small to be comfortable. Sandra avoided dinners. She showed up at a window sometimes, watching as if the scene outside had replaced some internal television. Colin's texts oscillated from pleading to aggressive. "You'll regret this," one read. Deborah smiled thinly and wrote responses that were firm, procedural, businesslike. The legal crescendo built in small notes: a letter from Colin's attorney suggesting mediation, an emailed threat referencing marital property laws, a terse demand for temporary shared control. Deborah responded with emotion to confirm the will's validity and an injunction against transfer without Claire's written consent. The legal language was boring but lethal: fiduciary duty, undue influence, bad faith transfer. It read like an architecture of protection. Claire's nights were shorter now. She sat in the hardware store long after the lights were off, hands in pockets, imagining the tool benches filled with students. She cataloged the equipment needed for classes: power drills, safety goggles, wire strippers. The store's back room, once a place of inventory and memory, transformed in her imagination into workshops and fluorescent light. The plan became as practical as any spreadsheet Colin ever made. When Colin realized Claire was not simply reacting but building, he tried a new tactic: charm turned into performative contrition. He sought public gestures, flowers left at her office, a staged apology in the parking lot. Each act was designed to create doubt, to soften witnesses, to complicate the narrative. But Claire had learned to separate intention from appearance. She remembered the sound of the broken mug, the voice memo whispering plans while she grieved. Apologies can be a strategy, evidence is not. As filings were prepared and the trust structures discussed with Deborah, the stakes sharpened into a high, clean line. Claire's aim was not revenge, it was custody of a legacy, custody of purpose. She would not merely defend an asset, she would convert it into a platform for others. That resolve steeled her for what was coming, a courtroom instead of a living room, legal battle instead of family pressure. The calm edge of strategy now replaced the stunned fog of betrayal. The stage was set. The courtroom smelled of paper and varnish and the thin metallic tang that always seems to gather where decisions are made. Collected there were people whose faces had been fixtures in Claire's life, the store's old regulars, a few of her grandfather's friends, and the core of a family that had split along internal longitude. Colin arrived with a shield of legal counsel and a colorless look that refused either humility or shame. Claire entered with Deborah at her side, dossier in hand and a quietness that felt like a loaded instrument. The hearing began with procedural formalities, the judge's gavel, a shorthand litany of filings. But there were moments that cut through the formality like sunlight. When Deborah stood, she did not rely on invective. She unfolded the timeline she and Claire had constructed, the will's date, the bank withdrawals mismatched to intended purposes, the invoice discrepancies, and the voice memo. The audio was played quietly, but clearly Colin's planning voice threaded into the hush of the chamber. Heads turned, a murmur passed like wind across a field. Colin's attorney countered with argument about marital property laws, conjuring gray zones and plausible deniability. He painted scenes of shared life, joint decision-making, and common account usage. He tried to transform affection into claim. But evidence resists being blurred into sentiment. Deborah moved through the contradictions with the coolness of someone teaching a class. She juxtaposed receipts to refunds, exposed shell payments, and then she asked the judge to consider undue influence, a legal doctrine tailored for precisely this sort of quiet, sustained pressure. At one point, the judge leaned forward and asked Colin a fundamental question. Did you ever discuss the transfer of these assets with your wife in explicit, documented terms? Colin's initial answer was a practiced hedge. Under oath, the hedges splintered. The voice memo, played again at Deborah's insistence, was now not just a piece of audio but testimony of intention. Under cross-examination, Colin's composure fractured. He admitted to having discussed plans with friends. He admitted to suggesting ways to improve liquidity. He balked at the word steal, but words matter less than patterns. There was a quieter, painful moment when Claire stood. She did not cry, she did not plead. She read a paragraph from her grandfather's note, just the small paragraph about seeing past money, and laid it on the bench like a placard. He left it to me because I listened, she said, voice steady. He asked me to be careful. I am asking the court to honor that and to prevent any undue influence over his final wishes. The simplicity cut through legal fog like a wedge. The final hour of the hearing felt like watching a house settle after an earthquake, the pieces shifting to new positions. The judge granted a temporary injunction preventing any transfers or establishment of joint control pending further proceedings. Colin's legal team, lesser men now in the face of documentary clarity, asked for continuance. Deborah proposed mediation only when it would not endanger assets. The decision felt less like a dramatic knockout and more like common sense enforcing itself. In the weeks that followed, Claire watched the slow machinery of justice do its work, hearing transcripts, subpoenas, and discovery. The injunction remained. Colin's attempts to challenge the will looked smaller, shrill even, when confronted by bank statements and medical attestations confirming her grandfather's competence. Deborah's precise motions left legal space for Claire to act without fearing predation. It was not vengeance, it was repair. Claire used the breathing space to formalize her plan, trusteeship, irrevocable protections, and the structuring of the Whitmore initiatives. She signed documents with the same steady hand she'd used to affix labels in the hardware store. Each notarized page felt like a shingle nailed down on a roof, practical, functional, impossibly necessary. The climax was not an exultant victory cry so much as a paragraph of hard, cold sentences that established boundaries and protections. That, in itself, was triumph. Reconstruction did not arrive as a headline, it arrived as a slow brightening. Claire transformed the backroom of Whitmore Hardware into rows of benches and a classroom corner with an old whiteboard. She hired instructors, women with calluses and certificates, people who could teach wiring, carpentry, small engine repair. The first class gathered like a cluster of nervous actors before opening night. Maria with her small, cautious smile, Jennifer with a determined knot in her jaw, Rebecca with quiet, focused energy. They came with stories, but they left with tools. The Edward Whitmore Home Improvement Grant opened with modest fanfare, $5,000 available to women who needed immediate safety modifications to their homes. The first application came from Sarah, whose hands trembled when she signed to receive funds for deadbolts and privacy screens. Claire met her on a Tuesday and watched as Sarah installed cameras, testing angles through focused eyes. Later, when Sarah sent a picture of her children playing in a porch swing that no longer creaked with fear, Claire felt a small, irrepressible seeding of something like peace. The store reopened with a new rhythm. The workshop smelled of metal polish and fresh-cut lumber, but also of coffee and laughter. Students measured, drilled, and learned the cadence of practical competence. Claire taught a basics of business module, pricing, invoices, how to build a quote, turning vocational training into a sovereignty lesson as much as a skill set. Women who'd been told they were too emotional learned to calculate margins. Those who'd been told tools were not for them learned to hold a drill steady enough to hang a shelf. Colin attempted a last-ditch motion to revisit the estate, a formal flurry that read like a tired echo of his earlier plans. Deborah handled it with a dismissive efficiency. The motion failed. By then, Claire's trust structure and the documentary record were formidable. He sent messages, some pleading, some aggressive, and she set them aside like unwanted mail. He became a minor weather event on the edge of her life, nothing like the storm he had pretended to be. The center expanded, automotive nights, women-only woodworking, and a weekend program teaching basic home electrical safety. Graduates began to offer peer support. Maria took on an apprentice. Jennifer started a side business offering house calls. Rebecca enrolled in community college engineering courses. Their progresses read like small protests against a lifetime of diminished expectations. Claire watched them, sometimes from a corner with her hands folded, and felt the old quiet satisfaction she had always gotten from fixing things with careful hands. 6 months after the hearing, Claire stood on a small stage in the refurbished store and cut a ribbon. Reporters asked questions about funding and sustainability. She answered in precise, modest sentences, but the bigger story was less about numbers than about a lineage of care. Grandpa's portrait hung over the workspace, a young man, sleeves rolled, eyes kind. Beneath it, a plaque read, "For the work we inherit and the work we choose." One late evening, after everyone had left, she found an old box in the stockroom. Inside were postcards Grandpa had written to customers, notes about patience and craftsmanship. She traced the handwriting and whispered thanks into the dust, words that felt like inheritance beyond money. That night she stopped by her little apartment and let Luna curl against her feet by the window. The space was small, but it was stitched with choices she had made. Claire never tried to make Colin a villain in the public record beyond what his actions required. The story was never meant to be a spectacle of shame. It was a lesson in boundaries and the craft of self-possession. When journalists asked what she'd learned, she said, "Listen when you're taught. Keep receipts. And, this is the important part, build things that outlast you." When the garden at the back of the store bloomed its first spring roses, she thought of Grandpa's line again, "It's about what you build with it." She smiled this time, not fragile but sure. The tools, the trust, the women learning to weld and wire, those were the inheritance she had honored. Money had been the initial catalyst, but the legacy had become motion, hands learning to repair, voices growing into counsel, a community steadying itself with practical confidence. Before closing one evening, Claire paused by the window, watching a group of students carry a heavy sheet of plywood between them. The scene was ordinary and perfect. She touched the brass key in her pocket, felt the smooth, worn circle of metal that had belonged to Grandpa's toolbox, and whispered, as if to him and to herself, "We made it matter."